Welcome to Brewsers, a podcast about beer, coffee, booze, and bruisers. I am your host, Rody John, and today we speak to Robert with Divine Science out of Tustin, California. We talk all about how they got started to being a gluten-free brewery and so much more. This is such a fun conversation. I was lucky enough to have them send me some beer, and their beer is phenomenal. You would not even know it doesn't have gluten in it, except for the fact you don't feel as full afterwards. So this is such a great conversation. We'll get to in just a second, but make sure to sign up for our newsletter. It comes out twice a week. You get even more information about our guests. You get fun facts, and you get to find out what's happening with your favorite podcast, all about beer, coffee, booze, and bruisers. So without further ado, here is Robert with Divine Science. I would like to welcome to the show Robert with Divine Science Brewing. How are you doing tonight, sir?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So for those listening, kind of paint us a word picture. Where are you at? What's going on around you right now?
Well, I'm at home right now, which is in South County, Orange County in California. And our tap room is based in a little town right next to Santa Ana called Tustin. So a lot of people are like, where's Tustin? And I'm like, yeah, I used to not know either. But I mean, we're still right in the smack dab in central Orange County, right? So like we've got Irvine to the south, we've got Newport Beach to the west. So we're kind of that like business district area where everybody goes and works and plays, and then they go back home to their home in like Newport Beach or, Huntington Beach, Coto de Casa.
Yeah. Huntington Beach always just reminds me of Tito Ortiz, and I don't know how much he actually still lives in that area, but
I mean, I haven't really had a sighting, but I know that there's a lot of that culture, that kind of like fighting culture. There's a lot of. I know that various different styles of martial arts are popular here, but I feel like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is probably one of the top, kind of people in my age demographic. That's probably the one that they're practicing the most in this area.
I did a class of jiu-jitsu and I was blown up cardio-wise just warming up. And I was like, I'm not that out of shape. What are they doing differently here that I am just not doing on a regular basis? And then we started rolling, and I was, I guess, surprisingly good for someone who had just started. And
That's
unfortunately,
good.
I did not continue just because of the fact that I could not afford it. It is rather expensive to do jiu-jitsu on a regular basis.
That's that's the thing. It's like, but it's like anything, right? Like for me, before I went professional with home brewing, with brewing, it was home brewing is like what I mean to say, right? It's like, you're like, yeah, I'm saving money. No.
I mean, you're making a mass of it, but you're also not saving the money really.
Well, yeah, especially because I liked to drink like the 9% saisons and stuff. So, and I like throw some like random crazy like honey this or this that, and you're like, wow, it was how much for this?
Yeah. Yeah, you start doing the backwards math. You're like, wait a minute, I don't know if I really saved any money doing this at all.
Right. I mean, I guess for me, there was really more the necessity part, right? So at Divine Science, everything we do is gluten free. So it really became kind of that, like all good things, necessity really is what brought it on. And it was kind of this element where it's like you want to share that with other people, right? You're like, I know I'm not the only one. And so I think that's one of the things that is what kind of spawned the whole Divine Science element of doing it professionally.
Right. I want to get into your gluten-free way of making beer, but I want to go all the way back in time before you really knew that gluten was going to be bad for you. What is your earliest memory of beer?
Sierra Nevada Pale Ale.
Was that also your gateway craft beer?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, like there was certain ones that were like too heavy for me sometimes when I was growing up, like the Celebration or whatever. I could only seem to be able to have one or two of them. Same with like Torpedo, but that beer that was kind of that always good go-to, and it was kind of really a very short period, right? Because I went gluten-free when I was like 22.
Oh, wow.
So right after discovering, breweries like Russian River and places like this, is right when I realized like, oh, I'm getting sick off this stuff. So a lot of people just stomach it, right? And
Yeah.
hey, more power to you. But for me, it was like really affecting my life.
Right.
So, you know what I mean? Like if you can't hold a conversation because you're literally just in the bathroom all night, it really starts to get in the way of your life.
Well, when did you realize that gluten was your, I guess I'm not gonna say enemy, but what is the thing that was really causing you to not enjoy, certain parts of life when it comes to beer or, I mean, I imagine food is the same way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it really felt like there was certain stuff that really was more of the trigger, like say beer or soy sauce is
Oh,
also a
yeah.
really big agonist for gluten sensitive people. But one of the things that I think is really tough is that it's such a mileage may vary thing, right? I initially thought it was something like an IBS or this or that. But I think the thing that helped me get to it a little bit quicker was that my mother had gone gluten free,
Mm.
because she had been doing a lot of different fad diets in the early 2000s, right? Atkins being one of them. And then there
Yeah.
was this like all carb diet. And then when she switched from between one or two of the others, then like her nail beds weren't growing and her hair was falling out, right?
Oh,
Like,
Lord.
and went to the doctor and it's like, oh hey, you know that like we gave you this diet for IBS? Yeah, that's wrong, and we're actually doing more harm. So you need to not have any more gluten at all, right? Because a lot of those diets, when you go into the IBS area, like you remove certain things, but you increase the load in other areas, like say breads and other sort of carbohydrates like that.
Huh. So,
So
okay.
yeah,
I mean, that's super interesting because, like, there's so many people that go almost their entire life and they don't realize that this thing or that thing was the cause of whatever it is. And I always say that I think people need, I mean, it's probably not cheap, and I don't know how insurance really works out this way, but like people need to know what their food allergies are. And like, as much as I've heard that you can do it with your genetic makeup testing and everything, but
right.
obviously going to a doctor and figuring out, okay, well, this is good for you and this is not good for you based on, your, like the genetics and your,
Yeah.
the way your body is made up anyway. So eat this, don't eat this. I mean, we've all heard now Tom Brady stayed away from tomatoes forever. I don't know how much he's delving into pizzas and pasta now, but um, you
Fair.
know, he just stayed away from the inflammation, and that's obviously what tomatoes do. And for your
Right.
body, that's what the gluten did. So, I mean, it's good that you realize that early, as opposed to, like you said, there's some people who go their entire life and are like, well, I'll just maybe not eat this, but they don't, fully understand why.
Well, I think there's a difficult element, as I mentioned, right? First of all, gluten being a staple. I've spoken to people like Dr. Fasano, who's one of the leading researchers in this space of celiac disease. And my conversation kind of felt really interesting. It felt like he kept coming back to this concept and he kept using the word staple. And it's because it's like, give us to say our daily bread, right? Like, it's very hard
Right.
to break that. You know what I mean? So it's like, I get it, right? And so, when you look at it, it's there was a lot of things in my growing up, right? Like, so I had so many ear infections as a kid that they would start me out at a higher level of antibiotic when I had like later sinus infections in my teenage years. And then I gave up gluten, and I've never had a single one of those infections since, right? So it's kind of like just flicking a switch. And that's, I think, the cool thing is that when you do unlock it, you're like, I remember playing like sports, right, in high school and college, and it was harder to get in shape. It took like 3 to 4 weeks where my teammates were in, oh, sorry, my dog. My teammates would be in shape in like 2 weeks, right? So, but when I went gluten free, I noticed that I was at that same pace too, right? So I think that's when you talk about the performance part of the Tom Brady element. I totally get that too. And I also recently have started limiting tomatoes in my diet as well.
There you go.
What do you know?
Thanks, Tom Brady.
Thanks, Tom Brady.
Well, I mean, let's go to when you started homebrewing too, because so I imagine that happened after you realized that gluten was not your friend. How did that work out with making beer? Like, I guess, like, where did the connection of either still making it with gluten or figuring out a way to take the gluten out? How did that all work when it came to homebrewing?
So let me see here. I never have brewed a barley beer.
Mm,
I've never brewed a barley based beer in my life to this point. Like, as a
congratulations.
professional brewer, I've never brewed a beer with barley, right? So basically it was kind of like, I didn't have a lot of that same element. I had people going, well, we do it a little bit differently here. And a lot of the times doing it the same way you did it as barley actually really didn't help. But I luckily had a good friend who, his roommate was a home brewer. And
Mhm.
they were like, it always just feels so weird you not drinking with us. Um, we'd love to figure out. I'm sure that it's not rocket science. There's probably a way this can be done. And then we found like sorghum syrup, and we started with that. It was a clean enough ferment by the second time we did it, and pretty tasty enough. And then I was like, there's got to be a little bit more. And then we kind of had a face palm thing, because when I started brewing, which was like late 2015, late 2015, middle 2015, I want to say. There had already been a website called Gluten-Free Home Brewing for like 3 or 4 years at that point, right? And they had a various plethora of all these gluten-free malts, and I'm like, what the hell? A quick Google search, and this would have been a fix.
What were we doing this entire time?
Right? And so that's the day that Google became my best friend.
Yes.
And so then, yeah, I really got into brewing. I ended up buying my own all-in-one system, and then brewing my own gluten-free stuff on a dedicated system, because I'm always kind of worried that, like, oh, okay, I had a bad night recently. Is that in a downstream of, doing it with this? Or, there was all these things that I didn't really know about actually good cleaning standards really that well at that point. I'm like, caustic, 135, swirl it around, scrub some stuff, right? But it was really only when I got into the professional side, and you really get exposed to things like peracetic acid, where you're like, oh, this is the thing that's probably doing the most of the cleaning, right? This is the thing that makes it so like I can have a sour beer in the same fermenter as an IPA right afterward. I mean, a lot of people, you wouldn't do that, but like I've seen it been done a couple times. I've gotten rid of Brett with peracetic. So I'm really happy with that chemical. But it's also very dangerous. Like you need to be like wearing a freaking hazmat suit to operate that. So I understand why they don't give it to homebrewers.
That's fair. Yeah.
So
You had to learn that
so
on your
yeah,
own.
so basically at scale and at a small batch, we're using ancient grains typically. So things like millet and buckwheat, but we also use things like corn and rice. There's some other ones that are sometimes okay because like 80% of celiacs can have oats, but that 20% you don't want to leave out, right? Because it's like it already sucks enough that you have celiac.
Right.
So and then in countries like Australia, oats are not allowed to be considered gluten-free. So I think when you look actually down under, they're the ones that are doing it probably the most right. Except there is this element where a lot of the, say if you were to buy millet offshore to try to grow it in Australia, it's actually really difficult because it doesn't really grow natively there. In fact, I don't believe it does, and they basically pasteurize all the seed that comes in, so that they don't want any invasive species essentially. So basically, it makes it so that you can't even germinate it, right? So they have to buy their malt from America. We can buy not desiccated and malted, right? So they have to fill like a whole shipping container and wait like 2 months just to get their malt to brew beer down there.
That's crazy. That seems like
Yeah, no,
so
it's a wild world, because basically I explained this to a fellow brewer recently because they were kind of griping about the prices, and I can totally understand because on the gluten-free side there really isn't like farm subsidies or mass scale really to gluten-free grains at this point. Some like rice and corn, but we're buying like heirloom varietals of blue corn and organic yellow maize, right? And those are then being malted, right? So it's like this different caliber of grain that we're kind of targeting. Also, the fact that the grain, in most cases, we're buying from producers that are not desiccating the grain, which means that can either affect yields, but really and truly, it really helps with the soil health, right? Because basically desiccation in America involves spraying the crop with glyphosate, which is Roundup, thus killing